Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Hunter, and I am the senior editor here at Livelong Media. So it's going to be an awesome conversation today, and I'm thrilled to welcome Anna Benevente, the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Registrar Corp. In a nutshell, she helps companies understand how to comply with the US FDA. That means basically helping companies like food products, cosmetics, drugs, supplements, making sure they are telling the truth on their labels, making sure that what goes inside of them complies with the FDA. And so today is going to be an amazing conversation because also I just learned from Anna and what we will dive into. The technical definition of healthy has changed. So that's going to impact all of our lives significantly because we all want to live our healthiest and best lives. So, with that in mind, let's dive into it. And I am very pleased to welcome Anna.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be talking to you about all of these amazing topics. You know, FDA has been very busy the last couple of years, and so they've been keeping me on my toes. So I'm really excited to share what I know and, help your viewers understand how FDA operates and kind of the changes that are going to be coming in the next couple of years.
So, on that note, I would love to first just quickly talk about this definition of healthy being different. Because I would just want to tell you, in my mind, healthy means feeling good, your body's working right, and everything's just up to code as we know it from a scientific perspective. What will that look like when it comes to what the FDA claims is healthy?
So the way that things have changed and evolved over the course of, the last 20, 30 years, in order for a product to make the claim healthy on the label. So the original rule was from like 1990. And back, you may not even have been alive back then, but I remember back then that all we really cared about was it low fat, and we didn't really care about carbs, and we didn't care about all this other stuff. And so the rule was written, in 1990. So as long as it was low fat and it had, like 10% of your daily allotment for a vitamin or mineral or fiber, you could just make the claim. So if you think about it, there are a lot of products, picture, like an artificially sweetened, beverage with artificial flavoring, but had enough vitamin C added to it that it met that 10% threshold, and it could just say healthy on the label, and because those were the only, that was really the only requirement. Then things sort of evolved, our understanding of nutrition evolved, and the role of healthy fats, the fact that like nuts and seeds and whole foods, were part of a healthy dietary pattern. And FDA started doing what was called enforcement discretion, where they were like, okay, if you don't quite comply in this way, but you've got salmon, which we understand is a healthy fish, we'll let you go ahead and make the claim. But it wasn't in regulation yet. And because FDA doesn't move very quickly, and changing regulations is a very time-consuming process, it just took forever until a couple years ago, they proposed to actually change the definition of healthy in the context of labeling. So now what they've done is they've taken, I don't know if any of your viewers have ever heard of this, but it's called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's a study that's put out by USDA like every 5 years or so. And it sort of describes sort of the nutritional state of the union in a way. And it provides a lot of recommendations. And, our understanding of nutrition has shifted so much from focusing on individual nutrients to whole food groups, healthy, what we now think of as healthy. The regulations have caught up, eat, healthy fishes and whole fruits and less processed food. And so now the way that the regulation is written, they don't even care about like the level of vitamin C in your product. It's all about, do you have certain amounts of these whole foods within your product? And it also makes allowances for, like, think about bottled water. Prior to this, could not make the claim that it was healthy, which sounds crazy to us, right? Like, how can water not claim to be healthy? But it couldn't, because it didn't have any nutrients per se. So it couldn't meet that 10% threshold for a vitamin or a mineral. So now if you have, unsweetened coffee or tea, if you've got bottled water, those will automatically qualify. Just it more encapsulates our understanding of nutrition now. And so we were really excited to see the proposed rule. And then now that the final rule has come out, companies will have a couple years to adjust, but we're all going to start seeing that healthy claim and understand that it actually represents current thinking rather than 1990s thinking about what healthy actually means.
So this is especially relevant, I feel, when it comes to anything you'd get in a package, right? So you mentioned ultra processed foods, and then all foods have a certain level of processing. So say I wanted a protein bar. Protein's big in longevity. It's big for health because it builds muscle and helps with just maintaining certain nutritional balances. Would certain ingredients in a protein bar now be considered healthy when they weren't before? Or on the other hand, could things that were once considered healthy actually no longer be considered healthy? And this is going to reflect how we also think about our long-term strategies for health.
Mhm. No, you raised an excellent point because this focus now for healthy is on these whole foods, in essence. If you have a processed protein bar that doesn't have the amount of whole fruit or vegetable or nuts or whatever the case may be to make that claim, it's not going to be able to claim healthy anymore. But it will, there are other types of claims that a product can make, even if it can't claim to be healthy per se. It could still claim to be a good source of protein if it has 10% or more of what your daily allotment for protein is supposed to be. If it does have, again, those, like if it has higher levels of vitamins and minerals by virtue of its ingredients, it can still make claims about those. It's just that kind of unilateral healthy claim is what's being modified. So those products may have to take the healthy claim off, but they can still highlight certainly nutrient levels within the product, so that if you're looking to have a high protein, lower carb type diet or something along those lines, you're still going to have access to that information.
Okay, that's great to understand because I think what I sometimes struggle with when I'm going out to the stores, and maybe you could shed some light, are claims on products. Sometimes they sound healthy. Like, even if it doesn't say the word healthy, high protein. Oh, okay, that's healthy, right? In my brain, great, that's healthy. What are some of the sneaky ways that marketing can try to label certain things that get us to think it's healthy, but in your experience, might actually not be that good for us? It's kind of greenwashing, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah, sometimes I think highlighting particular nutrients like that, like saying, oh, it's a great source of, protein, but ignoring the fact that it has, 20 grams of added sugar or something like that, that you don't want. The regulations are written to try and mitigate some of that. Like if you ever look at a vegetable oil label and you see cholesterol free, you're gonna think, sweet, like I'm gonna just drown my food in this. It's so healthy because it's got, it's cholesterol free. But there's a little disclaimer where in certain cases you are required to put, there's a lot of fat in this, please go see the the nutrition facts chart for fat content, or that type of a disclaimer. The regulations have that written in, but not for everything. So one of the things that I think we should do a better job of in this country is education about nutrition, in health classes, through, elementary, middle, and high school, and even beyond. It would be helpful for people to know, look at that nutrition facts label, understand what these different levels of nutrients mean, what should you be avoiding, what should you be trying to maximize in your diet. I mean, I think it's safe to say we could probably use an overhaul of nutrition education in this country, precisely for, all the reasons that they're changing the healthy claim, and, when we have a kind of a chronic disease situation. So
Does the
I think
FDA
education would
account
be
for
big.
chronic diseases when it comes to labeling and things? So Cheerios is heart healthy. And that's something for someone who has a heart condition or an age-related heart condition like heart disease, not even Cheerios, because our audience, a lot of people don't necessarily gravitate toward those types of foods like Cheerios. But let's say you have oatmeal. What's the difference between rolled oats versus whole oats from an FDA perspective? When it comes to grains, there's so many claims now that our grains, the FDA allows GMOs and certain things in to basically allows them in products that people would argue they shouldn't even be illegal to use and the FDA shouldn't approve it. So can you explain a little bit more about that and like the contradiction between that?
Yeah, so FDA, you know, is bound to rely upon, a significant scientific agreement when it comes to issues like that. And, they can't, as a government agency, they can't really start banning ingredients unless there's strong support, to show that something really should not be in the marketplace. And this is kind of where I think we all, as research evolves faster than government regulations do. And so I think we all kind of would do ourselves a service to kind of keep tabs on what is the latest research saying about, the different types of ingredients that are being added to our food, and just, educate ourselves to make good personal choices, based on what we're hearing. I think that dietary guidelines for Americans, I mean, it's a lot to read, but it's really interesting and really helpful when it talks about healthy dietary patterns and what constitutes a healthy diet according to the general understanding now within the scientific community. So that I think just educating ourselves is really helpful, because it does take a while and you wouldn't want government to make regulations kind of off on the fly,
Mhm.
because then you could inadvertently remove things from the marketplace that shouldn't be. So they do have to be very, very careful. But it's so very interesting, because um, consumers can certainly influence the way private companies work, sometimes maybe even more than the FDA can. You think about the clean label movement, think about the voluntary phase out of those synthetic colors, where you've got, Kraft and Nestle and all these companies voluntarily saying that they will remove these. And I think a lot of that is due to consumer pressure. So, we can influence things with our pocketbook. If we are buying products that have fewer additives and are, the colors are sourced from natural sources rather than the FD&C colors, companies pay attention to their bottom line, certainly more than anything else. And that's a good way for us to influence the type of actions that private companies take, even if FDA is a little bit slower on the uptake.
Other what I think about is the red 40, as you were saying with the colors, right? That's what it is, the red
Yeah,
40.
FD&C Red
And
40 is the big one.
what about other preservatives like polysorbate or benzoates, which the FDA has approved, but a significant population within the health community is saying, wait a minute, like these could be endocrine disruptors,
Mhm.
or other people are making claims based on some science. How long would it take the FDA to either make a change, decide to make a change, or decide to keep it based off of where science and popular opinion is at in a moment?
Mhm. Years, I think.
Years.
So yes,
Wowza.
yeah. So what was so interesting is that, the one dye that was actually banned was FD&C Red number 3. And that was brought about by virtue of a citizen petition. So as citizens, we can petition our government. And sometimes it's individuals and sometimes it's, interest groups. This one, I think, was the Center for Science and the Public Interest. But in collaboration with a number of different groups, where they brought forth, it's called the Delaney Clause, and it's like if there's any sort of indication that a substance could cause cancer in either humans or animal studies, then they're supposed to remove it. And what they did was show that there were animal studies where there was a link or something along those lines. I can't remember all of the details, but that ban was brought about by virtue of a citizen petition. So, and it's hard because the quality of data can vary. Some studies are, robust and, have, 10,000 participants. And then sometimes you see some of these where everybody's touting it and it's like one person. So,
Mhm.
FDA has to factor all of that in because as a government agency, they're, accountable to everyone. So, but that's how you can also influence when you have groups like the Center for Science and the Public Interest that are going to take action to get these sorts of things removed, but again, the most amazing thing when Secretary Kennedy said that he was going to ask for a voluntary phase out, I was like, there's no way. There's no way that all these companies are going to do this. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later or so, Nestle's like, yep, okay, we're going to go ahead and phase this out. Or maybe I think Kraft was the first one. And we're like, oh,
Wow.
okay, I guess they're going to do it, And I think a lot of that is probably consumer pressure and consumer demand and the clean label movement, more than Kennedy, trying to crack the whip.
Right. Because there's a lot of difficulty nowadays with people trying to discern with the healthy movement what parts of it are valuable and what parts of it are legitimate and what other parts of it may seem less grounded in certain science or facts. And so when it comes to the food movement, I have heard that there are positive strides being made when it comes to voluntarily getting rid of some of these things. So I think that's really interesting. And I want to know from your perspective, because you work with companies and you work with the FDA, what is the validity of, rather not what is the validity, what are some of the most exciting things you've been seeing when it comes to healthy changes in 2025 and going forward into 2026?
Mhm. I think I'll just really be interested to see how the dietary guidelines for Americans and that change in thinking about what constitutes a healthy diet and how that diet can then help try and mitigate the chronic disease situation that we have here in the US, and just see whether or not that starts informing other policies that are being put out. I've unfortunately learned over the years you can't expect things to happen quickly when you're talking about government, which, I say it a little tongue in cheek, but they have an entire, it's called notice and commentary, where if they want to change regulation, they have to put out a notice. They have to put out what's called a proposed rule to give all of us the opportunity to comment on it. And then they have to take into account all those comments before they issue any final rule to either add or change a regulation. So that's why it's so time consuming. It's important. It's, foundation of our democracy, but it is kind of time consuming. But I'm really curious to see how all of that informs policy moving forward. The ultra processed food that we were talking about earlier, USDA and FDA are going to be trying to come up with a definition for it. And so they had put up it's called a request for information, and the comments just closed maybe last week, where people could give their comments about what constitutes ultra processed food. And they have to be really careful with it, because then once there's a definition for it, they can regulate it and put requirements on it, or labeling requirements, or who knows anything, once that definition is in place. So for example, I know that one of the dairy industry organizations was very concerned that because it's, heat treated, that milk, which is, if you're not vegan or vegetarian, if you're okay with animal products, I drink milk, my kids drink milk, it's considered to be nutrient rich. If it gets branded an ultra processed food, then what limitations, do we inadvertently, pause on products that we actually want to encourage people to consume? So it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. Do they come up with a definition that people consider to be, kind of true to form, and something that they can regulate based off of? Or how's all this going to play? I'm popping my popcorn and I'm sitting watching and ready for everything to come down and see where all of this goes.
It's interesting because you not you worry, but you wonder if there's going to be a lot more demonization of certain foods or ingredients that might not be as unhealthy as they're made out to be because they have the label ultra processed, which carries a lot of weight, a lot
Mhm.
of weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And oh, continue.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, because, when we think is when you think about ultra processed, are we talking about manufacturing methods like pasteurization and that sort of thing? Are we thinking, oh no, thinking more like it's got, one real ingredient and then 20 food additives, where are their heads about what constitutes an ultra processed food? I mean, think about like a lot of our breakfast cereals, are fortified, which I have a picky eater son, where I'm like, God bless my fortified Honey Nut Cheerios, because at least I can know that that boy is getting some vitamins and minerals. Where are their heads about what constitute ultra processed foods? Is it about the ingredients or is it about the manufacturing methods? Where's all of this going to play out?
So it just from an interesting perspective, you mentioned milk, and I was just thinking about processing and pasteurization, which was pretty important for humanity, right? And disease and whatnot. Do you believe, or should the FDA approve raw milk? And so the idea that these alternative health practices, so the idea of raw milk, is that healthy? Would that be something that could be considered healthy, or is it something that's like, whoa, it could be a disease risk, but more people want to do it because it has more nutrients, right? Is it healthier? So that
Sort of fall in the anti-raw milk camp, honestly. So, pasteurization is one of those things where it's kind of there for a reason. I mean, it's different if you're like living on a farm and you're grabbing it from your own cow. But when you think about the transport, of milk, and if it hasn't been pasteurized, if it does end up contaminated, then you have a serious issue on your hands. So I don't know that FDA would ever come out with any sort of public statements or, change the rules and regulations about pasteurizing, when you're talking about interstate commerce and everything, the pasteurization of milk, just because things go sideways, and they really do go sideways sometimes with the raw milk. So, yeah.
right, right. So I kind of want to wind down a little bit here, but I wanted to do a little bit of green flag, red flag when it
Okay.
comes to FDA and certain foods and products and labels. So, one thing I wanted to first start by asking is that, in your opinion, is anything that's considered FDA approved automatically a green flag?
No.
Okay. Why?
Well, because I think so the way that ingredients are regulated in the US, we have basically three different categories. You have what are considered food additives, where FDA has reviewed the safety data, and formally approved that particular ingredient for addition to food. Then you have color additives, which even if they come from natural sources, go through the same process where the FDA reviews the safety information and so forth, and then formally approves them. But then you have what's called generally recognized as safe, or GROS. And you
Mm,
may have heard, Kennedy and Macari and them talking about the self-affirming GROS loophole. So in essence, what it is that there's an exception in the law where everything has to be approved unless it's generally recognized as safe by qualified experts, kind of like in the scientific community and industry and so forth. FDA has affirmed certain ingredients as being GROS, where they've said, yep, we've looked at the information. Yep, it's definitely GROS. There's a process called the GROS notice, where industry can formally inform FDA, hey, we've looked at the studies, we think it's GROS, this is what we found, we're just letting you know. But there's also in the law the ability for companies to self-affirm and not notify FDA that a substance is GROS. So if I'm a food manufacturer and I'm using some novel new ingredient, and in theory, I've looked at the data, I'm like, oh, sure, it's safe, I don't have to inform FDA. And that's one of the more kind of groundbreaking announcements that came out of Kennedy's FDA, which is that they are looking to close this, what they call a loophole,
mm,
where companies don't have to notify FDA when they bring new ingredients into the marketplace. Because, maybe Nestle Nestle's probably convened a panel that's going to look at everything and make sure it's safe. But maybe not everybody is, and they're just putting these ingredients in the marketplace. So you can't just assume because it's in the
Oh,
marketplace that FDA has approved it.
oh. So it's almost like companies, especially smaller independent guys who are getting up and running with a product, they won't be able to add that ingredient without telling the FDA, look, I'm adding it. I think it's safe. I'm here to tell you. They have to tell them that.
That's what that's what Kennedy and the FDA are shooting for. Right now, I
Okay.
can add it. I can just say, oh, sure, I've got safety data and just start selling it. Now, FDA can always come and demand proof, but they got to come find me and
Oh,
demand proof, right? So what they're proposing to do is eliminate the ability for companies to simply say, yep, I've got my data, I'm good, I'm going to toss it in my product and start selling it. So that's what
isn't
they're
that
proposing to
kind
get
of
rid of.
how supplements work? Because supplements don't need FDA approval.
We might have to do another completely different webinar
Yeah.
on
Okay. Wait.
supplements.
I won't open that. I won't open that one. But
So,
this is
yes,
fascinating.
supplements, yeah, supplements are, they're regulated a little bit differently in that it's called the dietary ingredient. So whatever the point of the supplement is, if it's the ginseng, the vitamin, the mineral, whatever the case may be, that particular ingredient is not subject to normal food additive regulation. But if it's new to the marketplace, you are supposed to submit a notification to FDA before you start marketing it to provide safety data. Now, but then the question becomes, because the products themselves don't have to get approved, how many people are actually doing that the way they're supposed to?
Oh boy. Oh boy. We don't we don't want to go
I know
down there.
that's a wormhole and a half.
That one's a wormhole.
Yeah.
But when it comes to food label, and now we want more notification of this, should consumers look for food products that have been third party tested, or do you think that's not necessarily needed in order to be consuming a healthy product?
I guess it would depend on what firm or what sort of certification the product is claiming. Like I know for supplements, I've seen that mostly on supplements where, they'll have, an independent third party verify, because some, like with supplements, a lot of the issues that we've seen over the years, that FDA has seen have been people who claim that it's got this certain herb in it, and it turns out, they tested and it's sawdust in a capsule, that sort of like
Yum.
shenanigans. So, I think there's something to be said for some of those supplements where they say, hey, we've got this third party that is independently verified that what's in here is what we say it is, and so forth. I haven't seen a lot of that in the case of foods. There are, I think, you see for some that are like related to like dietary restrictions, like the vegan check mark and, vegan society and that sort of thing, or non-GMO project, for people who are looking to avoid certain types of ingredients or foods, for whatever reason, then those can be helpful. But I don't know that there's any sort of certification, like everything in here is, okay. And, I don't know of any like a kind of overarching certification like that exists at this point.
Oh, okay. Because I know a few products have they even have the research on the label. Oh, look, we researched it in this lab, and this product is XYZ for you or whatnot. And I know the lately the angle for a lot of food companies is use science is on our side. Maybe it's because of podcasts, right? But like
Might
more
be.
more food companies are saying, here's why you should eat this. Here's why it's healthy. Let's give you a little bit of the backstory. And they're putting that right on the label.
Mhm.
So I just think that's super interesting thing I'm noticing. But the last thing I'm very curious, and I would love to ask you, what do you eat and how do you eat after having worked with the FDA and understanding like health and a little bit more about how to scrutinize a label? What do you turn to?
Well, I think, you know, there's some processed foods in my pantry. I'm not gonna lie,
Ew.
you know. So, as I've sort of followed sort of the evolution, kind of, our understanding of nutrition, try and just eat lots of, leafy green vegetables and, lean meats, though I like a steak, not gonna lie, and just kind of hitting that balance, sort of what we all sort of inherently know we should be doing. But then, again, like I have some processed foods in my house and everything. Like I don't go completely, as I maybe should. But, I think everybody just should, think about what we just sort of inherently know about nutrition, you know, shopping on the outer sides of the grocery store, that, how they say, oh, like all the processed foods are in the middle, and that you
Mhm.
should hit the outer edges of the grocery store,
Mhm.
just trying to eat that way, and, teach my children to eat that way, and I mean, I feel pretty good. Like my health is pretty good, and I attribute a lot of that to exercise and to trying to make sure that I eat right.
And it's the foundational stuff. So despite the FDA changing the definition of healthy, from what I'm also hearing, we all probably have a great basis of what health is. And a lot of these regulatory changes are going to be impactful for how we read food labels, more so when it comes to things that aren't whole foods. But it also is changing what how we think about health, and it might even sometimes, from what I'm understanding, you can't just trust the label, because if it can't technically say healthy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not. So there's a lot of layers here, and there's a
Mhm.
lot to dive into.
Yeah, and I don't ever want to demonize food additives. They were created for a reason. They certainly help preserve food, and, they serve a function, most certainly. I think we all just, just take a long, hard look at, what we eat day to day, trying to maximize, again, the foods that we just inherently know are healthier for us. But, I don't want to demonize, food additives or processed foods either. It's just all about a balance, I think.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you joining today. And that I wanna rain check that supplement conversation, because
We'll have an interesting conversation about the
that
supplements.
that could be a naughty little wormhole to go down when it comes to what we think is healthy.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anna,
Absolutely.
for being here. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. So excited to have joined you and been able to share what I know.